Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 1075 for September 22nd, 2024. Coming up in a few minutes.
I get a lot of flack from the sales and marketing team because it absolutely is something that we should be proud of, but it just rubs against my natural humility, right? I'm much more happy to talk about the efforts of the team over any personal efforts of myself. So holding up the flag and saying that we were the first is, it's easier every time I say it, but every time I say it, I feel a little guilty.
Caitlin Bartlemay is one of the up-and-coming distillers on the American craft whiskey scene. She's the head distiller for Hood River Distillers and Clear Creek Distillery in Oregon, and makes what's widely acknowledged as America's first single malt whiskey, McCarthy's. I'll talk with Caitlin later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Ever wondered where Redbreast got its name? Well, let's go back to 1912 and be glad our bird-watching founder didn't spot the bar-tailed godwit that day.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Gabriel Cardarella from Jewers here. The 2024 U.S. Open Championship may have ended, but you can still get your hands on the whiskey created to honor it. The new Jewers 19-Year-Old Champions Edition. Trust me, a whiskey you don't want to miss. More details coming up.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. We'll begin with the news that Edrington has sold the Famous Grouse blended Scotch brand to William Grant & Sons for an undisclosed amount. The move will allow Edrington to focus on its premium brands, including the Macallan, the Glenrothes, and Highland Park single malts. We've reported in recent weeks on the sales woes at large whiskey makers. Craft distillers are not immune to those problems, as a new report from the American Craft Spirits Association and Park Street Consulting shows. The annual Craft Spirits Data Project report found craft distillers suffered a 3.6% decrease in sales volume during 2023, with the value of those sales off by 1.1%. It's the first time since the project began in 2016 that craft distillers have reported declining sales, and ACSA Chief Executive Margie Lehrman says the industry needs some help.
We've been told again and again and again that U.S. small businesses are the backbone of the U.S. economy. I'm going to say that again. The U.S. small businesses, which craft spirits producers are a large part of, are the backbone of the United States economy. So if this is true, I'm going to suggest that we're in severe need right now of either yoga blocks to help us stretch that backbone, or alternatively, physical therapy, giving us the tools that we need to keep our backbone strong.
ACSA leaders are calling for regulatory changes at the state and federal levels to make it easier for craft distillers to self-distribute their products, streamline bureaucratic paperwork, and allow distillers to ship via the U.S. Postal Service. Despite the challenging environment, the number of U.S. craft distillers continues to grow. It's up 11.5% to 3,069 distilleries as of last month. Campari made news on two fronts this week. The Italian company took a minority stake in Cape Van Holdings, the parent company of Bunnahabhain, Deanston, and Tobermory distilleries in Scotland, for $92 million. Cape Van was founded 2 years ago after Distill's Scotch whisky holdings were spun off into the new corporation, founding Distill's takeover by Heineken. Shortly after that deal was announced, Campari CEO Matteo Fantacchiotti announced his immediate resignation for personal reasons after just 5 months on the job. Former CEO Bob Kunze-Concevitz is leading the search for a new CEO. Two other personnel moves to note. Darren McCormick has been promoted to distillery manager at Lochley Distillery. He's been with the distillery since it was built and takes over for John Campbell, who left earlier this year to pursue other opportunities. John, of course, was the longtime manager at Lafroig Distillery on Islay, where Barry McCaffer stepped down in June to join a distillery project in South Korea. Our sources on Islay tell us native Iliac George Campbell has been named the new manager at Laphroaig. We heard from Keeper's Heartmaster distiller Brian Nation back in May, and now his latest creation is hitting the market. It's a 21-year-old Irish single malt from Cooley Distillery, finished in Tokai wine casks. The limited edition release carries a recommended retail price of $999 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. J.P. Wiser's is out with the second release in its Decades series. The 28-year-old Canadian whiskey was distilled in 1996 and aged in a combination of French oak, Hungarian oak, and Canadian whiskey casks. There's no word on pricing. My Lemon Green has released its third volume of Unabridged, its cask-strength unfiltered bourbon. It blends Kentucky bourbon with bourbons from Texas and Tennessee for a complex yet approachable taste. Look for it nationwide with a recommended retail price of $94.99. I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. Widow Jane Distillery is out with its annual release of The Vaults. This year's edition is a 15-year-old bourbon finished in Amburana wood casks. It hits the market next month with a recommended retail price of $250 a bottle. Colorado's Old Elk Distillery is out with a new straight wheat whiskey finished in French Limousin oak casks. The whiskey was matured for 6 years before being transferred to the French oak casks for an additional 6 months to a year. It's available nationwide with a recommended retail price of $89.99 a bottle. Indiana's Hard Truth Distilling is out with 4 new limited edition whiskeys, including the Master Distillers Reserve 2024 blend, a double-oaked sweet mashed rye, the barrel-finished Reserve 2024 blend, and a maple brulee rye finished in maple syrup casks. Prices range from $69.99 to $89.99 a bottle. I'll have tasting notes for them soon at WhiskyCast.com. The family behind Chicago's Koval Distillery is expanding its portfolio with a new line of organic whiskeys under the Thresh and Winnow label. There's an organic 10-year-old rye whiskey and an organic single malt. From Scotland comes word that Bladnoch Distillery has added new 13- and 16-year-old single malts to its range, and it's bringing together all of its age statement whiskeys as the Heritage Collection. The Manaya, Leora, Samsara, and Alinta single malts are being rebranded as the Twinned Cask Collection to reflect the 2 cask types used in each one. Glenfiddich has released Grand Chateau, a 31-year-old single malt that's unique in that it's the first Glenfiddich expression to be finished in red wine casks. The whiskey spent 9 years in Bordeaux wine casks. It'll be available for a limited time at $2,100 a bottle. And finally, Johnny Walker has unveiled what may be the lightest glass whiskey bottle yet for a special release of Johnny Walker Blue Label. Blue Label Ultra weighs about the same as a mobile phone, but is still a 700-milliliter bottle. It's a limited edition release, largely because the technology to produce the teardrop-shaped glass bottles is not scalable yet. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Let's open up the calendar and see what's happening around the world of whiskey. The Chicago Indie Spirits Expo is Tuesday night at the Chicago Hilton. The Twisted Tail in Philadelphia has its annual Whiskey Bonanza on Thursday night. Whiskey Live Paris is also this coming weekend. We'll start off October with the debut of the Halifax International Spirits Fest in Halifax, Nova Scotia, October 3rd through the 5th. Edinburgh's Whiskey Festival is on the 5th, along with Bourbon on the Banks in Frankfort, Kentucky. The Brandy Library in New York City has an exceptional Scotch Spirit School class on the 8th, and Whiskeys of the World Atlanta is on the 12th. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it. We'll add it to the calendars at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app.
Every year, Dewar's, the official Scotch whiskey of the U.S. Open Championship, rolls out a special limited edition whiskey to celebrate that year's tournament. The 2024 championship wrapped up in June, but the 2024 Dewar's 19-year Pinehurst edition is available now, and you don't want to miss it. This year's 19-year whiskey is double-aged, then extra-matured in rye casks, offering a rich profile with notes of pear and heather honey. There's a hint of spice in there, too, along with a dusting of cinnamon and cocoa powder. It's a sensory delight for any true whiskey or golf fan. So trust me, my fellow aficionados, grab a bottle and enjoy a whiskey crafted with the same skill and precision that makes the U.S. Open legendary. Please drink responsibly. Copyright 2024. Dewar's Blended Scotch Whiskey, 46% alcohol by volume. Imported by John Dewar & Sons, Coral Gables, Florida.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Oban and the Classic Malts lineup. There's an exciting new generation of distillers bringing creativity and unique whiskeys to the whiskey world. One of them is Caitlin Bartlemay, who worked her way up through the ranks to become head distiller at Hood River Distillers in Oregon, where she makes the McCarthy's American Single Malt. I talked with Caitlin on a Zoom call the other day. I say this a lot, but one of the things I like to do when we bring somebody new on for the first time is sort of get your background. How did you get your start in distilling? I know it's an interesting story.
Yeah, some people say that my start to distilling was a direct line. I was absolutely, totally, specifically destined to be in the role that I'm in. On a personal level, I don't feel like it's necessarily been that direct, but I grew up on a wheat farm in Eastern Oregon, and my dad's, midlife hobby was fermenting things in the basement, and I was his right-hand man, as it were. I grew up driving tractors. I think I was in a tractor and a combine by like 9 and 11, and we did everything together. I learned how to, replace, fix tires, replace bearings, do gaskets, grease, and maintain all that equipment. So I was you're very practical, sensible farm kid. And so when Dad started fermenting things, I was like, yeah, absolutely. Let's ferment things. This is cool. And then with the dawn of Food Network and the ranch actually getting satellite TV, which was a big deal, I was absolutely hooked on food and food science and fermenting. And lucky for me, Oregon State University, which is our college in our backyard here, has a really robust and renowned food science program. So I got my degree there, and it was while I was at Oregon State that I became really interested in distilled spirits. And part of the interest was that there was so little to be found out about it at the time. That the amount of consumer transparency that exists now across all brands is incredible. In the 14 years that I've been here at Clear Creek, when I first started, you couldn't go to a Brown-Forman website and see what a mash bill was. You couldn't learn about all the fine details of how, pot versus continuous distillation. There just wasn't that much information, let alone the breadth of consumer groups and aficionados that are around the world digging into all this information and essentially getting all this history out of all these brands and making it accessible. So just the fact that there was so little information available made it all the more intriguing. And so I cold called every distillery in the Pacific Northwest. And as Steve McCarthy, the original founder, would put it, I didn't give him an option to not hire me, but I just kept calling because they never told me to stop calling. And I was very fortunate. They hired me the day after my last final at Oregon State. And I've been with the brand now across 2 facilities and now with new ownership after Steve's retirement in 2014. So it's been quite a ride. It's an honor to be a part of this brand and to continue the legacy not only of what Steve McCarthy built, but also be a part of the brand family of Hood River Distillers.
And that legacy includes the first American single malt that we know of in McCarthy's.
Correct. That is correct. Yes, first distilled in 1994, first released in 1998. As far as anybody has been able to find, as far as we've been able to find, and also members of the the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission, it is the first post-prohibition American single malt.
That's got to make you proud.
Oh, it's incredibly proud. And to be honest, though, I get a lot of flack from the sales and marketing team because it absolutely is something that we should be proud of, but it just rubs against my natural humility, right? I'm much more happy to talk about the efforts of the team over any personal efforts of myself. So holding up the flag and saying that we were the first is easier every time I say it, but every time I say it, I feel a little guilty because it's such an honor to be a part of the community of American single malt producers. And many people came across this idea. We weren't breaking ground, but absolutely, as somebody that is very passionate about American single malt, to be carrying the torch for McCarthy's American single malt is absolutely an honor.
You must be frustrated with the TTB over the delay in getting a definition for American single malts, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's been a long, quiet 2 years from the TTB. I've been saying for a very long time that, we lay our heads down on our pillow every night, hoping and wondering and wishing that the next day we wake up and we're American single malt producers in the eyes of the TTB. It hasn't happened yet. I'm certainly very excited for this big push that the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission has been putting on in the last couple months. Absolutely happy to have signed a letter myself personally, as well as the team here at the distillery, to urge the TTB to get this done, because now is the time, right? We know things that are going to slow down. We know we're headed for a new administration, no matter where the chips fall. And I would hate to see this drag on for another year, 2 or 4 years.
What would it mean to the industry to have a definition?
We talk a lot about the definition not being the silver bullet, but I think that's what it's going to take for a handful of, restaurants, restaurant chains, and certainly liquor stores to actually feel that they have the faith in the category to actually start putting, lists in their menus and shelves in their stores that are specifically dedicated to American single malt. It's, the consumers have decided that it's definitely a category, right? There's definitely, the number of podcasts and excited aficionados looking and seeking out all these different single malts. They are excited about the movement. There's over 250 American single malt producers in a category on the global level where we're looking at just over 900 total producers around the world across 41 countries. So the producers have also clearly decided that it's a category and it's a category worth celebrating. And so we're missing that connection in between the consumers and the producers. And also when you're talking about being on the global stage, it's if our own government hasn't decided that this category is valid, then how do we hold our heads up on the global stage, right? And so really that's where it is when we talk about entering in and being part of those 41 countries. Granted, I think just over half of them have official rules that come from either their governments or the broader EU in order to describe what a single malt means to them. But if we're going to be a part of the global single malt community, it's really important that we get that TTB ratification locked down.
Let's move on to another topic now. What's the best lesson Steve McCarthy ever taught you?
Oh boy, that's a great question, and certainly not one that gets often asked. I think likely the best lesson that Steve taught me was to keep pushing and to keep asking, right? The worst answer you can always get is no. And when it comes to representing a small brand like Clear Creek Distillery and like McCarthy's, it's really hard to fight for your place on that shelf against people that are making, creating and selling over 100,000 cases a year. We're still a small craft facility based here in Hood River, Oregon. And Steve's tenacity for the brand, Steve's passion for the brand is definitely something that he's passed on to me. And then I encourage and try to pass on with all of the distillers here, both Garrett Trotter Ramos and Everett Rubin, because this brand continues to exist and existed in its founding because of Steve's tenacity and his passion for the story of what we're creating and the liquid credentials of everything that goes into a bottle that has Clear Creek on it.
And you produce a bunch of other spirits too, right?
Correct. Yes. Clear Creek Distillery processes over 1 million pounds of Pacific Northwest fruit into fruit brandies and liqueurs every year. Just over half of that is in Bartlett pears from the Hood River Valley, which is where the distillery is located. So we're actually in charge of not only all of the Clear Creek Distillery branded items, McCarthy's American Single Malt, but also a handful of independent brands that we create for our larger parent company, Hood River Distillers. And that includes Timberline Vodka and the new DeGraff Amaro and Aperitivo in partnership with Dale DeGraff. And then a line of finished bourbons, and that's Kentucky bourbon that we bring from Kentucky and finish here in Oregon. So we stay really busy, even though As a distilling team, we're only 3 people. And then as Hood River Distillers, celebrating our 90th anniversary this year, we're still a family-owned company with 70 total employees.
So it's still a small business.
Oh, absolutely a small business. And Hood River Distillers does a lot. We have 30 brands, of which Clear Creek and McCarthy's are only 2, and that's spread across 300 SKUs. So for 70 people and a small family business, we stay busy, and we make sure that we're moving with the times and making sure that we're making quality things, quality items for prices that make us easy to put on consumer shelves.
Let's talk about the whiskeys for a second. Let's start with the basic McCarthy's single malt. Tell me about it.
Well, McCarthy's is a rule breaker in a lot of ways. We already touched on the fact that it's the first American single malt, but as the first American single malt, while there was definitely some inspiration from an Islay style Scotch whiskey, almost immediately Steve started breaking rules. The original inspiration definitely was to use Oregon peat and Oregon malt. And in the early 90s, craft brewing was taking Portland, Oregon by storm. So all the pieces existed in Portland at the time. And unfortunately for Steve's vision, the small malt houses weren't able to take on his project without every craft beer in Portland ending up being a smoky and peaty craft beer. So he turned to his inspiration, the peat malted barley from Scotland, and started importing that malt from Scotland, which is what we still do today because that's the flavor of McCarthy's. But immediately, it is pot distilled, which is very traditional to that style. However, we're distilling it on a hybrid pot still that we bought to make all of our Clear Creek brandies, which means it's a pot with a very short rectifying column on top of it, which means we're only actually distilling that wash once. So it's single pot distilled with a small rectification column. And then instead of aging it in, ex-American oak barrels or solely sherry casks or whatever, we are aging it in 100% Oregon oak casks that are all medium toast. So there's no char that is involved at all with the aging of McCarthy's. And the first release was 3 years old, and we in 2021 released a 6-year, and now we have 2 sherry cask finishes, an Oloroso and a Pedro Jimenez to join the whole lineup. But for a very long time, and Steve's original launch, it was a 3-year single pot distilled, 100% Oregon oak single malt whiskey.
And you do your brewing at a local brewery, right?
Correct. Yes. We are, as a distillery, essentially a winery with distilling equipment, where a lot of distilleries are breweries with distilling equipment. And because we're still a small facility, it doesn't make sense to have our own brewing equipment yet. And all the principles and the values of both Hood River Distillers and Clear Creek Distillery is always continuing to participate in our community. And so in working with local brewery partners, our current partner is Double Mountain Brewing here in Hood River, we're able to build more of our community and build up our small businesses here in the area by having them brew the wash, and then the wash comes up to the distillery already fermented. They're really great. I can't say enough about how awesome Matt Swihart and his team are. And the brewery itself is I think 2 miles away from the distillery. So it's very conveniently close by. But we always want to make sure that we're completely transparent about that. We include our brewery partners on the labeling of McCarthy's. We originally started with Widmer, and we've been with production with Double Mountain, I think, for 9 years so far. So.
Is that something you might change given your background in fermentation?
I would love to. I love working with Double Mountain. It would be awesome to bring that process all the way into the distillery. It's just gonna take the brand having to grow a little bit more before we outpace the capacity of our brewing partners. That's kind of where we are right now. Once we need to get over that threshold so that it makes sense to have our own brewing facility here.
Give me a sense of the difficulties that craft distillers are facing these days.
Well, it's definitely difficulties that aren't just facing craft, really. As you see the reports in, it's not just craft distilleries that are suffering right now, but it's really the entire global marketplace. Certainly, there's been softening across the world. When you see places like Remy and Brown-Forman and Diageo altering their quarterly expectations and seeing downturns for the first time in a very long time, that is, the struggles that they experience are going to be tenfold for your craft distilleries, right? Because they still have that larger footprint. They still have that brand notoriety and recognition. And more importantly, even if they're hurting, they still have those deeper pockets to spend more money and more time creating events and doing marketing spends and advertising spends. And Clear Creek Distillery, all craft distilleries, they just don't have those deep pockets. And we try to build our consumer base slowly over time with fans that are familiar with our reputation and not only buy a bottle to try something new, but continue to buy a bottle because they know that the quality is always going to be exceptional. But as far as growth, with over 3,000 craft distilleries, we're still fighting essentially the loss of consumer education through after Prohibition. And so every craft distillery not only is fighting against each other for shelf space and against the big dogs for shelf space, but we're fighting against consumers that don't understand the difference between craft and some of the bigger guys, and encouraging them to take a chance on a local brand and to take a chance on something new and exciting. And to move away from kind of their tried and true and long time tested bottles that they're familiar with. So that's the struggle, right? We can't compete with the big guys, and competing against each other really isn't fair either. So it's just that going up against the amount of consumer education and trying to convince everybody that buying their local brand and buying something new is worth the effort and worth the risk.
How big a problem is distribution for you?
Distribution is always a bit of a struggle, right? Especially when you're a craft brand, because distributors are definitely going to be looking more towards brands that are going to be moving tens of thousands of cases. And when you're trying to move a couple thousand cases, it's easy to get lost in the sea of other craft brands. And so we definitely love working with distributors that have spirit specialists that are specific and focused on craft and what craft has to offer bar programs and consumers. But yeah, it's in the increasing consolidation of distribution across the country. As a small brand, it is hard to make sure that your brand stays relevant and is in the top of mind in consumers, brand reps, bartenders, everybody. It's really easy to get squashed in the sea of voices.
How do you define success as a distiller?
Boy,
is it in awards? Is it in sales? Is it in personal accomplishments? How do you define success?
I think the at this point, the raw and capitalist answer is going to be sales, right? Being able to see that increase in sales, even if it's just, single percentage points year over year, that means that we've reached more people and we've got more people excited about what we do. But as far as what I personally believe would be success, it's the fact that we have such a great team here at Hood River Distillers, and specifically the distillers here at Clear Creek. The fact that, I can go, they're both fairly new distillers. Everett's been here for just about a year. Garrett's been here for about 3 years. And as a part of my job, I'm spending an increasing amount of time away from the distillery and working out in the marketplace and talking to people. And the fact that I can be in some far-flung place and people can stop by the distillery, a distributor can stop by the distillery for a tour, or the leadership team can bring someone by for a tour. And I am 100% confident that anybody that comes to visit the team here at Clear Creek Distillery is going to leave not only with a head full of fun facts about how distilling works, but also a little piece of the passion that Steve shared with me and that I have shared with the team. Everything that we do here has a rich and beautiful history. And so to me, when the team works well together and the team as a whole is just as passionate about any individual, not only about the brands themselves, but also taking care of each other, that in my mind is the true measure of success.
Thanks to Caitlin Bartlemay of Hood River Distillers for joining us on this week's WhiskyCast In-Depth. It's brought to you by Oban, a deliciously smooth single malt known for its coastal charm and Highland heritage, loved by whiskey lovers worldwide. Discover Oban's full lineup at malts.com. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with the new Keeper's Heart 21-year-old Irish single malt that I mentioned during the news. It's originally from Cooley Distillery and is finished in Tokai wine barrels. It's bottled at 48.5% ABV. The nose is fruity and floral with red grapes, raspberries, and baking spices. The taste is tart and peppery with notes of white pepper, lemon zest, red grapes, and baking spices, and the finish is long with touches of raspberries, dried fruits, and lingering spices. I'm scoring the Keeper's Heart 21-year-old Irish single malt a 94. Turning now to bourbons, let's look at the new Angel's Envy Triple Oak Bourbon. This one is bottled at 46% ABV, and it's finished in a combination of Hungarian oak, French oak, and Chinkapin oak from Kentucky. The taste has touches of butterscotch candies, black cherries, honey, vanilla, and a hint of maple syrup. The taste is full of butterscotch and honey sweetness, balanced by a hint of cinnamon and a touch of cherry cola. The finish is long and warming with lingering spice. I'm scoring the Angel's Envy Triple Oak a 93. Finally, Maker's Mark has released its oldest whiskey ever with the 2024 cellar-aged bourbon. It's a blend of 13 and 14-year-old bourbons, more than double the age of the whiskeys that go into the flagship Maker's Mark whiskey. It's bottled at 59.65% ABV, and the nose has touches of cherries, oak tannins, caramel, subtle spices, and a hint of chocolate malt. The taste is oaky and tannic with wood spices, cinnamon, cherries, and honey, but adding some water brings out a note of milk chocolate on the palate. The finish, long, oaky, and spicy. I'm scoring the Maker's Mark 2024 cellar-aged bourbon a 91. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of nearly 3,800 different whiskeys at the WhiskyCast website. Check it out this week.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
So, in Spain, they call Redbreast Petit Roco. It's me, but a touch more exotic. Kind of like a Redbreast PX edition. Finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, adding a velvety and decadent dimension. You know, I won't lie. A climate like this makes me wish I was a migratory bird.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's open up the inbox now and see what people are talking about this week. Our community segment is brought to you by Waterford Whiskey. Heard from Peter Hosek in the WhiskyCast community app. Hi, Mark. You mentioned in the latest news that the Benromic 50-year-old is their oldest edition ever. There are so many old bottlings coming to the market today that no one pays attention any longer. But to Benromic's credit, as far as I know, they produced their very first 50-year-old back in 2019, adding a whiskey base ID, when it wasn't that usual yet. Thank you, Peter. I stand corrected. HRC had a comment on Campari's acquisition of a minority stake in the owners of Bunnahabhain, Deanston, and Tobermory distilleries. Interesting adds to their portfolio. They've got Wild Turkey and Wilderness Trail, and I believe Glen Grant, but not much else Scottish-wise. Very true, Glen Grant is the lone Scotch whiskey in the Campari portfolio. Tyrone Cote posed an interesting question in the app the other day. Was sipping whiskey last night with a few friends and found that I was not enjoying a whiskey I previously liked. Have you ever had a whiskey that you liked or didn't like on different occasions? Christopher Glenn responded with this. Yep, I've noticed time of day and even the group I'm tasting with can affect it, as well as whatever I've eaten recently. I've heard of a study with different music played for people tasting, and even though the whiskeys were all the same, people reported different tasting notes. Crazy stuff. ARR added this comment, yes, I have. With me, it often has to do with my level of ease and relaxation. Now, when I don't have time to relax and enjoy a good whiskey, I'll have something simple and save the good stuff for another day. And Scott Rogers chimed in with this. For me, it's more of a seasonal thing. In warm weather, highly peated Scotch doesn't really connect with me. Whereas in the cool months, I love some Islay but don't really connect with bourbon the way I do in summertime. Thanks to everyone who participated in the WhiskyCast community app this week. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, download the free WhiskyCast community app from your app store. You can also find us on X, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. And the email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Our community segment is presented by Waterford Whiskey on the web at waterfordwhiskey.com.
100 individual farms of Irish barley, separately harvested, malted, fermented, distilled and matured. Is that too much effort? Perhaps. Unless you're interested in flavour above all else. Waterford Whiskey, the most naturally flavoursome single malt.
Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. Whiskey depends on barley, and like all crops, barley is under threat from climate change. Fortunately, barley has the ability to adapt itself to the local environment, and researchers at the University of California, Riverside are trying to pinpoint which genes make barley successful and high-yielding in a particular environment. Their study, which appears in the journal Science, identifies how genetics enables barley to flower in just the right window, since flowering either too early or too late means the plant won't be able to produce seeds. The scientists relied on a nearly century-old barley experiment at UC Davis. Back in 1929, breeders started pitting thousands of genetically different strains of barley against each other to see which would perform the best in California's climate. Over 58 growing seasons, the field went from 15,000 genetically different individual plants to a single plant lineage that dominated the field without human intervention. Because barley is genetically similar to corn, wheat, and rice, the scientists say insight into how it thrives in diverse environments could be used to help those other grains adapt as well. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just get in touch with us. That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on X, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, or you can use the WhiskyCast community app. Download it today from the Apple and Google App Stores. Our email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
The 2024 release of Dewar's 19-Year-Old Champions Edition is out now, available at Dewars.com. Get it while you can and appreciate every double-aged rye cask finished dram. Please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2024, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.